Humanity learned early that the universe did not care whether anyone understood it. The first vessels to leave the cradle world were built on equations that worked even when the reasons failed, and the first crews learned to trust machines that could not explain themselves. By the time the long-range exploration ship Unfurling Answer crossed the boundary where mapped stars thinned into conjecture, the people aboard had inherited that habit. They trusted what functioned. They trusted what endured. They trusted one another because there was nothing else to trust when the distances grew so large that even memory seemed to stretch thin. The ship carried fewer than 200 souls, chosen not for perfection but for resilience, and they slept and woke beneath a hull layered with alloys designed to flex rather than shatter, because someone long ago had learned that rigidity was a promise to break. The Unfurling Answer had been traveling for almost 11 years by ship time when it reached the region where the signal appeared. It was not a message in the comforting sense of language, but a repeating anomaly in the background radiation, a pattern that refused to smooth itself into randomness. At first, it was flagged by an automated system, then reviewed by human eyes that had been trained to distrust coincidence. The anomaly did not come from a single point, but from a lattice of sources arranged in a geometry that suggested intent rather than accident. It was older than the ship by orders of magnitude, older than humanity's first radio transmissions, perhaps older than the species itself. It was a footprint left in the fabric of space, and the crew stared at it with the uneasy understanding that footprints implied walkers. Captain Mara Ionescu did not believe in destiny, but she believed in responsibility. She had been born on a station that orbited nothing, raised among people who measured home by air recyclers and shared meals, and she had learned that survival was an act renewed every day. When the anomaly was confirmed, she convened the senior staff in the central briefing chamber, a room designed with curves rather than corners to prevent stress fractures during maneuvers. She listened more than she spoke, a habit that had earned her the trust of those who served under her, and when the arguments finally wound down, she made the decision that would define the rest of their lives. They would investigate. They would not turn away from the unknown simply because it had teeth. The approach took months. The anomaly resolved into structures so vast that the mind struggled to frame them, arrays of matter and energy that braided around one another like the skeleton of a god. They were not symmetrical in the way human engineering favored, but they were balanced, each tension countered by another, each force answered. The ship's sensors struggled to interpret what they were seeing, and more than once the crew had to recalibrate assumptions that had been taught as universal truths. The structures were not inert. They shifted slowly, with a patience that suggested a scale of time beyond individual lifespans. They were not alive in any way humanity recognized, but they were not dead either. They were something built to last until the universe itself grew old. The first contact did not come with warning shots or grand proclamations. It came as a change in local physics, a gentle alteration of constants that made the ship's drives hum with unfamiliar harmonics. The crew felt it in their bones, a subtle wrongness that set teeth on edge and raised hairs. Before panic could take root, the ship's systems adapted, adjusting parameters on the fly in ways that would have been impossible a century earlier. Human technology had been shaped by 1,000 disasters and near misses, each one a lesson burned into design. It bent and flexed, found a new equilibrium and held. The structures around them responded in kind, as if acknowledging the adaptation. Something was watching. Communication followed, if it could be called that. The anomaly's pattern intensified, modulating in response to the ship's emissions, exploring the contours of human signal space without ever settling into language. The crew tried mathematics, then physics, then abstract representations of logic, and received responses that mirrored the form but not the content, as if an echo were trying to understand the voice that cast it. Days stretched into weeks, as both sides probed and adjusted, and slowly, painstakingly, a bridge began to form. It was not built of words, but of shared constraints, of mutual recognition that certain patterns meant survival and others meant annihilation. Humanity had learned to communicate under fire, and that hard-won skill served them now. When understanding finally coalesced into something approaching dialogue, the truth was staggering. The structures were part of a civilization so ancient that its members had long since transcended biological form. They called themselves nothing that could be translated, but their self-concept revolved around preservation. They had arisen in an era when the universe was hotter and denser, and they had watched stars be born and die in numbers beyond counting. They had seen species flare briefly and vanish, and they had concluded that life, left to itself, was fragile to the point of futility. To counter that, they had built the lattice, a network designed to stabilize regions of space, dampening catastrophic events and extending the lifespan of cosmic structures. In doing so, they had also constrained the potential for rapid change. Evolution slowed. Civilizations plateaued. The universe became safer and quieter, but also static. Humanity's arrival was an anomaly within an anomaly. The lattice had not accounted for a species that thrived on instability, that adapted not by avoiding stress, but by absorbing it and turning it into strength. The ancient beings studied the unfurling answer with a mixture of curiosity and unease, sensing in its construction a philosophy alien to their own. Where their structures sought equilibrium, the human ship embraced redundancy and controlled failure. Where they smoothed fluctuations, humanity exploited them. The dialogue that followed was cautious, probing the boundaries of this difference. The ancient beings asked, in their way, why humanity risked so much, why it did not seek the peace of stasis. The answer, when it came, was not a manifesto but a history, shared in compressed narratives of struggle and recovery, of worlds lost and rebuilt, of mistakes made and learned from. It was the story of a species that had no guarantee of tomorrow and chose to act anyway. The response was not immediate. The lattice shifted, currents of energy flowing along paths that had not been used in eons. The ancient beings were not accustomed to doubt, but doubt took root nonetheless. They had believed that safety was the highest good, that minimizing suffering required minimizing change. Humanity's existence challenged that axiom. The crew felt the weight of that scrutiny, aware that their actions might influence a power beyond their comprehension. Captain Ionescu convened the crew again, not to debate, but to share the burden of awareness. She reminded them that they were not ambassadors chosen by destiny, but people doing their best with limited information. She reminded them that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. As the dialogue deepened, the ancient beings revealed a concern that cut closer to threat. The lattice was failing, not catastrophically, not yet, but entropy gnawed at even the most enduring constructions. Sections had begun to drift out of alignment, and the beings lacked the capacity to innovate as they once had. Their existence had become so stable that the very mechanisms of change had atrophied. They could maintain, but not transform. Without intervention, the lattice would eventually collapse, releasing energies that would devastate vast swathes of the cosmos. They had watched this possibility approach with a detached resignation, unable to conceive of an alternative. Humanity, with its reckless adaptability, represented a variable they had never accounted for. They asked, not with desperation, but with genuine uncertainty, whether humanity could help. The request sent a ripple through the crew. They were explorers, not saviors, and the scale of the problem dwarfed anything humanity had faced. Yet the underlying challenge was familiar. Systems failing under accumulated stress, solutions constrained by old assumptions, the need to rethink from first principles. Engineers and scientists aboard the unfurling answer began to sketch models, their minds racing with possibilities. They saw in the lattice not a monolith, but a collection of subsystems, each of which could be modified to introduce controlled variability, to allow the structure to heal itself rather than merely resist decay. It would be risky. It would require changes that might accelerate failure if misapplied. It would demand trust between beings who barely understood one another. In short, it would demand everything humanity had ever been forced to become. The ancient beings listened as the humans proposed their approach, sensing the undercurrent of uncertainty and resolve. They asked for justification, for proof that embracing instability would not hasten destruction. Humanity could not offer certainty. They offered precedent instead, a record of survival against odds that had once seemed insurmountable. They offered the argument that stagnation was a slower kind of death. The exchange was not a negotiation in any conventional sense, but a meeting of philosophies at the edge of necessity. In the end, the ancient beings agreed to a limited trial, a modification of a peripheral segment of the lattice under human guidance. It was a concession that would have been unthinkable a millennium earlier, and it marked the first time the lattice would change by choice rather than erosion. Preparations began immediately. The unfurling answer maneuvered closer to the selected segment, its hull singing as it passed through gradients of force never intended for vessels of its size. The crew worked in shifts that blurred together, driven by a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. They adapted human tools to interface with alien constructs, inventing new protocols on the fly. Every success was provisional, every setback a lesson. Captain Ionescu moved among them, offering quiet encouragement and decisive direction, her presence a steadying influence. She knew that leadership in such moments was less about commands than about reminding people who they were. As the trial commenced, the modified segment of the lattice began to behave differently. Where once it had resisted perturbation, it now absorbed and redistributed them, small fluctuations cascading into larger adjustments that restored alignment rather than undermining it. The ancient beings watched with intense focus, their perception attuned to shifts that would have been invisible to human senses. There were moments when the changes threatened to spiral out of control, when alarms screamed and calculations raced against time. Each time, the crew responded, tweaking parameters, accepting minor failures to prevent major ones. It was a dance on the edge of chaos, familiar to those who had navigated atmospheric entry or managed failing reactors. It was humanity's element. When stability returned, it was of a different kind than before. The segment was not frozen in place, but alive with motion, constantly adjusting to maintain integrity. The ancient beings acknowledged the success with a surge of activity that translated, imperfectly, into something like astonishment. They had built the lattice to endure by resisting change, and here was a way to endure by embracing it. The implications rippled outward, challenging assumptions held for longer than humanity had existed. The dialogue that followed was no longer cautious probing, but earnest inquiry. The ancient beings wanted to learn not just the mechanics of the modification, but the mindset behind it. Humanity found itself in the strange position of being both student and teacher, sharing lessons learned the hard way. The first chapter of that shared history closed not with triumph, but with commitment. The unfurling answer would remain, its mission transformed from exploration to collaboration. Humanity would lend its capacity for adaptation to a civilization that had forgotten how to change, and in doing so, it would be changed in return. The universe had not cared whether anyone understood it, but for the first time, it seemed to pause, as if listening. The decision to remain within the lattice altered the rhythm of life aboard the unfurling answer in ways subtle at first and then profound. Exploration had always carried with it an implicit promise of forward motion, a sense that whatever was behind you was finished, and whatever lay ahead would demand reinvention. Now the ship occupied a region of space that was both ancient and active, a place where the past exerted gravitational pull on every action. Time itself seemed layered. The crew woke, worked, and slept according to familiar cycles, but outside the hull processes unfolded on scales that dwarfed individual awareness. The lattice did not rush. It waited, adjusted, observed. In response, the humans were forced to confront their own impatience, their instinct to measure progress in days and weeks rather than epochs. The ancient beings did not reveal themselves as individuals. They had long ago abandoned any sense of separateness that could be mapped onto human concepts of self. Instead, they interacted through distributed presence, focusing attention where needed and withdrawing it elsewhere. To the crew, this felt like being observed by weather rather than watchers, an omnipresent pressure that waxed and waned without warning. Some found it unsettling. Others found it oddly comforting, a reminder that intelligence need not always announce itself with faces or voices. Over time, patterns emerged. Certain regions of the lattice became hubs of interaction, places where the ancient beings concentrated their awareness to engage with human efforts. The crew began to recognize these shifts, learning to read the lattice's moods as sailors once read the sea. Work began with analysis. Humanity's first instinct when confronted with a problem of scale was to break it down, to impose structure on complexity. Teams mapped sections of the lattice, translating alien metrics into human-readable models. The task was humbling. The lattice operated on principles that blurred the line between matter and energy, using configurations that defied classical categorization. Yet within that strangeness were echoes of familiar ideas, feedback loops, thresholds, redundancies. The engineers and scientists found themselves oscillating between frustration and exhilaration, each insight opening new questions. They argued fiercely, tested assumptions, discarded cherished theories when evidence contradicted them. It was messy, inefficient, and deeply human. Captain Ionescu encouraged the chaos within bounds. She understood that innovation thrived on friction, but she also knew that unchecked conflict could fracture a crew already under strain. She instituted rotating leadership within project teams, ensuring that no single perspective dominated. She mandated rest periods, even when enthusiasm threatened to override exhaustion. In private moments, she wrestled with doubt. The responsibility she carried was immense, and the consequences of failure were cosmic in scope, yet she reminded herself that paralysis would be worse. Humanity had never advanced by waiting for certainty. As the humans delved deeper, the ancient beings observed not just the outcomes, but the process itself. They were intrigued by the way humans tolerated error, even leveraged it. Mistakes were logged, analyzed, and incorporated into future attempts rather than erased. This stood in stark contrast to the lattice's original design philosophy, which treated deviation as something to be suppressed. Through the imperfect bridge of communication, the ancient beings expressed confusion. Why allow failure when it could be prevented? The humans responded not with abstract justification, but with demonstration. They showed how systems that never failed became brittle, how small errors prevented larger catastrophes by revealing hidden weaknesses. It was a lesson humanity had learned through painful experience, now being offered as a gift. The next phase involved scaling the initial success. Modifying a peripheral segment was one thing, applying similar principles to core regions of the lattice was another entirely. The risks multiplied. The ancient beings hesitated, their collective attention tightening around critical structures. Trust, they realized, was not a switch, but a gradient. Humanity sensed this reluctance and adjusted its approach. Instead of pushing for sweeping changes, they proposed incremental integration, embedding adaptive elements that could be isolated if they behaved unpredictably. It was a compromise that reflected mutual learning. The lattice would not be torn apart and rebuilt overnight. It would evolve slowly under careful watch. Life aboard the unfurling Answer adapted as well. The ship became a hybrid space, part human vessel, part interface node. New compartments were repurposed to house equipment designed to interact with the lattice, their interiors reshaped by necessity rather than aesthetics. Crew members developed specialized roles that had never existed before, acting as translators between human intuition and alien logic. Training programs emerged on the fly, pairing experienced engineers with those skilled in abstract reasoning or pattern recognition. Bonds formed across disciplines, forged by shared challenge. The sense of isolation that had accompanied deep space travel was replaced by a different kind of pressure, the awareness of being enmeshed in something vast and consequential. Not everyone coped easily. A few crew members struggled with the loss of clear boundaries, the feeling that the ship was no longer a refuge but a permeable membrane. Dreams grew vivid and unsettling, filled with geometric forms and impossible vistas. The medical team monitored stress indicators closely, offering support where needed. Humanity had prepared for the psychological toll of isolation, but this was something else, intimacy with the incomprehensible. Captain Ionescu made herself available, listening to fears without dismissing them. She acknowledged that courage did not preclude vulnerability and that admitting strain was not weakness. In doing so, she reinforced a culture of honesty that would prove essential. The ancient beings, for their part, began to share more of their history. It was not nostalgia that motivated them, but context. They wanted humanity to understand the origins of the lattice, the traumas that had shaped its creation. Long ago, they had faced extinction events that wiped out entire star systems, random and merciless. In response, they had sought control, building structures to shield against chaos. Over time, that response hardened into doctrine. Change became suspect. Innovation slowed, then ceased. They survived, but at the cost of vitality. As they recounted this, there was no self-pity, only a stark assessment of consequence. Humanity listened, recognizing echoes of its own history in different form. This exchange of stories deepened mutual respect. The humans no longer saw the ancient beings as static overseers, and the ancient beings no longer saw humanity as reckless interlopers. Differences remained, profound and sometimes irreconcilable, but they were now framed by understanding rather than assumption. That understanding was tested when the first major complication arose. A core region of the lattice exhibited instability far beyond projected parameters. Adaptive elements introduced nearby began to interact in unforeseen ways, amplifying fluctuations instead of dampening them. Energy surges rippled outward, threatening to cascade through interconnected segments. Alarms blared aboard the unfurling Answer as systems strained to keep pace with rapidly changing conditions. The ancient beings reacted with alarm that bordered on panic, their collective focus snapping to the endangered region. For them, this was confirmation of their deepest fear, that embracing change would hasten destruction. The humans did not have the luxury of ideological debate. They acted. Teams scrambled to model the runaway interactions, isolating variables and testing countermeasures at breakneck speed. Decisions were made with incomplete data, guided by experience rather than certainty. Captain Ionescu coordinated responses, delegating authority and trusting her crew to execute. There were moments when failure seemed inevitable, when the sheer scale of the forces involved dwarfed human intervention. Yet within that chaos, patterns emerged. The instability was not random. It followed paths shaped by the lattice's original rigidity. The very structures designed to resist change were now channeling it destructively. Recognizing this, the humans proposed a radical maneuver. Instead of trying to suppress the surge, they would redirect it, carving new pathways through less critical regions of the lattice. It would mean sacrificing parts of the structure, allowing them to degrade or even collapse to save the whole. The suggestion horrified the ancient beings. they had never willingly abandoned any portion of the lattice. To do so felt like betrayal of their foundational purpose. Communications strained as urgency mounted. Humanity insisted that loss was unavoidable, that refusing to choose would guarantee greater devastation. The ancient beings hesitated, torn between doctrine and survival. Time forced the decision. With seconds stretching into eternities, the ancient beings yielded, granting permission to proceed. The humans acted immediately, deploying tools and algorithms designed to guide the energy surge along new routes. The lattice groaned, metaphorically speaking, as sections flared and faded. Some segments went dark, their functions irreversibly altered. But the cascade slowed, then stabilized. The core region held. The immediate crisis passed. In the aftermath, there was a period of heavy quiet. Not silence, but something akin to collective breath held. The ancient beings processed the loss, their attention lingering on the damaged regions. Humanity waited, uncertain how their actions would be judged. Captain Ionescu prepared herself for condemnation, even expulsion. She had known the risks and taken them anyway. When communication resumed, it was subdued but clear. The ancient beings acknowledged that the intervention had prevented a far greater catastrophe. They also acknowledged that their aversion to loss had nearly doomed them. This admission marked a turning point. It was not gratitude that filled the exchange, but humility. Reconstruction began, informed by the lessons of the crisis. The damaged regions were not restored to their previous state. Instead, they were reimagined, incorporating adaptive principles from the ground up. The ancient beings participated actively, their contributions shaped by newly awakened curiosity. They asked questions that would have once seemed pointless, explored configurations that introduced variability by design. Humanity guided where it could, learned where it must. The relationship shifted from tutor and pupil to something closer to partnership, though the imbalance of scale remained vast. Aboard the unfurling Answer, the crew felt the change. The pressure eased, replaced by cautious optimism. They had faced a trial and emerged with their philosophy validated, not by abstract argument, but by necessity. Yet the cost weighed on them. They had witnessed the sacrifice of structures older than their species, and the gravity of that could not be dismissed. Memorials were improvised, small rituals to acknowledge loss. Humanity had learned to honor what was gone even as it moved forward, and that practice found new expression here. As weeks turned into months, the lattice's behavior grew more dynamic. It no longer resisted every perturbation, nor did it surrender to chaos. It flowed, adapting continuously. The ancient beings reported sensations they had not experienced in ages, a renewed sense of engagement with existence. For humanity, the work became less about crisis management and more about stewardship. They were shaping not just a structure, but a philosophy that might influence the cosmos for epochs to come. The chapter closed on a quiet moment. Captain Ionescu stood alone in the observation chamber, gazing at the lattice as it shimmered with activity. She reflected on the improbable path that had brought them here, on the fragile thread of decisions that separated survival from annihilation. She knew that greater challenges lay ahead, that the universe rarely allowed victories to stand untested. But she also knew that humanity had brought something rare to this ancient place, the willingness to change, even when it hurt. And for the first time since entering the lattice, she felt not just hope, but purpose. Purpose, once found, had a way of attracting consequence. The lattice's transformation did not go unnoticed, because nothing of that scale ever truly existed in isolation. As adaptive principles spread through its structures, subtle shifts propagated beyond the immediate region, altering gravitational balances, energy flows, and the long-established equilibrium of neighboring cosmic systems. Some of these changes were beneficial, preventing stellar instabilities that would have flared catastrophically under the old rigid regime. Others were disruptive, introducing variability into regions that had grown accustomed to predictable patterns. The universe responded as it always did to novelty, unevenly, with pockets of harmony and pockets of conflict. The first sign that this would not be a purely internal matter came through a distortion at the edge of sensor range, a pressure wave that did not match any known natural phenomenon. The unfurling answer detected it as a compression in spacetime gradients, too deliberate to be random. At first, the crew assumed it was an artifact of their own modifications, a delayed reaction of the lattice settling into a new configuration. But as the wave resolved, it became clear that it carried structure, intent, and propulsion. Something was approaching, something that navigated the universe by means humanity had never encountered, yet with a precision that suggested long familiarity with forces most species never touched. The ancient beings recognized it immediately, and the change in their collective focus was unmistakable. Attention snapped outward, threads of awareness converging on the incoming presence. Through the shared interface, a pulse of information surged toward the humans, laden with urgency. The newcomers were not strangers in the absolute sense. They were a civilization that had arisen far from the lattice's core, one that had learned to exploit the stability it imposed. Where the ancient beings had sought preservation through control, this other civilization had pursued dominance through optimization. They had built themselves into forms that thrived under fixed conditions, stripping away redundancy, variance, and anything that did not serve efficiency. For eons, the lattice had been their unspoken ally, freezing the universe into a state that favored their design. Now that state was changing, and they had noticed. Captain Ionescu convened the senior staff once more, the familiar ritual taking on new gravity. The briefing chamber felt smaller than it once had, as if the walls themselves sensed the weight of what was discussed within. The ancient beings projected what they could of the approaching presence, translating incomprehensible data into abstract visuals the humans could grasp. The image that emerged was unsettling, a formation of entities that were neither ships nor organisms in any conventional sense, but tightly integrated systems of matter and energy, shaped into configurations that maximized function while minimizing waste. There was no ornamentation, no allowance for failure. Every component existed for a reason, and that reason was enforced with absolute clarity. They will not negotiate in the way you understand negotiation, the ancient beings conveyed. They perceive change as threat, inefficiency as error. They have shaped themselves to endure only one kind of universe. Humanity had encountered inflexible powers before, though never on such a scale. Empires, ideologies, systems that could not bend without breaking. The pattern was familiar, even if the context was not. The crew's initial reactions ranged from defiance to dread. Some argued that the lattice's transformation should be slowed or paused, buying time to understand the newcomers' intentions. Others contended that retreat was impossible, that any attempt to revert would be seen as weakness. Captain Ionescu listened, weighing not just the arguments but the emotions behind them. Fear, resolve, anger, responsibility, all were present and all were valid. The ancient beings added a stark assessment. If the newcomers perceived the adaptive lattice as an existential threat, they would attempt to neutralize it. Their methods were efficient and final. They would not attack out of malice, but out of necessity as they defined it. This was not a clash of good and evil, but of incompatible survival strategies. Humanity found itself, once again, at the intersection of philosophies older and larger than itself. The irony was not lost on anyone. They had introduced change into a stagnant system to prevent decay, and now that change had drawn the attention of a force that depended on stagnation to exist. There was no clean solution. Any choice carried risk, not just for the lattice and its ancient custodians, but for countless regions of space influenced by its behavior. The decision, when it came, was shaped by humanity's defining trait, refusal to accept false binaries. Instead of choosing between confrontation and capitulation, the crew proposed a third path. They would attempt communication, not to seek compromise on outcomes, but to reframe the problem itself. If the newcomers understood the adaptive lattice not as a weapon or disruption, but as an evolution that could be navigated, perhaps even leveraged, there might be a chance to avoid annihilation. It was a gamble bordering on arrogance, but so had every major human advance been. The ancient beings were skeptical. They had observed the newcomers from afar for millennia, noting their rigid patterns and relentless optimization. Dialogue had never been established because there had never been anything to discuss. The lattice had provided stability, and the newcomers had flourished within it. Now, that stability was eroding, and the ancient beings doubted that explanation would suffice to assuage fear. Humanity acknowledged the risk, but insisted that inaction guaranteed disaster. At last, the ancient beings agreed to allow an attempt, if only to gather more information. The unfurling answer repositioned itself, moving closer to the projected interception point. Its systems were tuned for maximum resilience, layers of contingency stacked upon contingency. The crew prepared communication arrays that blended human signal structures with lattice-mediated modulation, hoping to create a channel that could be perceived without triggering defensive responses. As they worked, tension mounted. Every minute brought the newcomers closer, their approach marked by distortions that grew sharper and more intense. When first contact occurred, it was abrupt and overwhelming. The incoming presence flooded the local spacetime with a barrage of structured emissions, each one a probe testing boundaries, mapping responses, seeking weaknesses. The ship's systems strained but held, adapting in real time. The lattice itself responded, its newly flexible structures absorbing and redistributing the stress. For a moment, the entire region felt like a living thing bracing against impact. Humanity's message was simple in concept, complex in execution. It conveyed not demands or apologies, but context. It illustrated the lattice's transformation, the reasons behind it, the looming threat of collapse that rigidity had failed to address. It did not frame the change as a moral imperative, but as an engineering solution to entropy. It acknowledged the disruption this caused, the risk imposed on civilizations adapted to the old regime. It did not promise safety, but offered collaboration in navigating uncertainty. The response, when it came, was chilling in its clarity. The newcomers acknowledged the information, processed it with staggering speed, and returned a verdict. Their existence, as configured, could not tolerate increased variability. Their internal systems were optimized for a narrow band of conditions. Adaptation, as humans understood it, would require dismantling efficiencies that defined them. From their perspective, the adaptive lattice represented a future in which they would inevitably fail. Therefore, the rational course of action was elimination of the source of change. The message contained no anger, no threat. It was a statement of intent, delivered with the same neutrality one might apply to shutting down a malfunctioning machine. The ancient beings reacted with a surge of defensive activity, their focus flaring across the lattice as they prepared countermeasures long unused. Humanity felt the shift like a tightening of air. The crew knew that if it came to open conflict, the scale would be unimaginable. The lattice could wield forces that reshaped star systems, but doing so would risk further destabilization. The newcomers, for their part, had honed their offensive capabilities over eons of internal refinement. Victory, if it could be called that, would leave the cosmos scarred beyond recognition. Captain Ionescu faced the moment she had dreaded. Communication had failed to avert the core incompatibility. The choice now was not whether to fight, but how to redefine the battlefield. In a tense exchange with the ancient beings, humanity proposed something unprecedented. Instead of defending the lattice as a monolithic entity, they would fragment its engagement, creating zones of differential stability. Regions where adaptive principles dominated would be insulated from regions where rigidity persisted. It would be a messy compromise, allowing pockets of the old universe to remain intact long enough for dependent civilizations to adjust or migrate. It would also expose the lattice to uneven stress, increasing complexity and risk. The ancient beings recoiled at the idea. Fragmentation ran counter to their deepest instincts. The lattice had been built as an integrated whole, its strength derived from unity. To divide it felt like self-mutilation. Humanity countered that unity enforced without flexibility was already killing it. Fragmentation, while dangerous, offered a path that did not require immediate annihilation of those who could not adapt. It was not a permanent solution, but a bridge. The newcomers did not wait for consensus. As deliberations stretched, they began to maneuver, their formations aligning along vectors that suggested imminent action. Energy densities spiked. The universe itself seemed to tense, as if anticipating violence. With time running out, the ancient beings made a decision that would have been unthinkable before humanity's arrival. They agreed to attempt fragmentation, to reshape the lattice's response not as a single shield or weapon, but as a mosaic of environments. The execution was chaos refined into purpose. Human teams coordinated with ancient systems, translating adaptive algorithms into commands that reconfigured lattice segments at breathtaking speed. Boundaries formed where none had existed, gradients of stability and change interleaving like tectonic plates. The newcomers reacted instantly, recalculating trajectories, adjusting tactics to exploit perceived weaknesses. In some regions, they pressed their advantage, unleashing forces designed to collapse adaptive zones. In others, they hesitated, encountering rigid pockets that matched their expectations and posed no immediate threat. The unfurling answer rode the storm at the heart of it all. Its hull vibrated under stresses that would have torn lesser vessels apart. Inside, the crew worked with grim focus, fatigue and fear held at bay by necessity. They monitored cascading effects, patched failures, made choices that sacrificed local integrity to preserve broader function. Humanity's approach to crisis was on full display: triage, improvisation, relentless adjustment. In one critical zone, fragmentation began to fail. The boundary between adaptive and rigid regions oscillated wildly, threatening to unravel both. The ancient beings flagged it as unsalvageable, recommending isolation and abandonment. Humanity saw another possibility. By injecting additional variability, they could dampen the oscillations, but doing so would erase the rigid pocket entirely. It would force any civilization within to confront change immediately or perish. The moral weight of that choice hit hard. Captain Ionescu did not shy away from it. She authorized the intervention, knowing that delaying would doom far more. The zone stabilized, transformed into a fully adaptive region. The immediate threat passed, but the cost lingered as an unspoken ache. Humanity had chosen the lesser catastrophe, as it so often had before, and carried the burden of that choice forward. As the confrontation unfolded, it became clear that the newcomers were struggling in unexpected ways. Their optimization, once a strength, became a liability in the fragmented environment. Systems designed for predictability faltered when faced with uneven conditions. They adapted, but slowly, constrained by their own design philosophy. Humanity observed this with a mix of grim satisfaction and sorrow. The pattern was painfully familiar. What made you strong in one era could destroy you in another. After what felt like an eternity compressed into hours, the intensity waned. The newcomers withdrew from the most volatile regions, consolidating around pockets of rigidity that remained intact. They did not retreat entirely, but neither did they press the attack to its logical conclusion. The fragmented lattice held, battered but functional. The universe did not end. In the aftermath, communication resumed, strained but present. The newcomers acknowledged the new configuration of space. They did not accept it, but they recognized that immediate elimination of the adaptive lattice was no longer feasible without unacceptable cost. They issued a projection instead. Over time, as adaptive regions expanded, civilizations like theirs would face extinction unless they fundamentally restructured themselves. They did not frame this as a plea or threat, merely as an outcome. Humanity responded not with reassurance, but with an offer. They shared models of gradual adaptation, pathways that preserved core function while introducing redundancy and variability. They did not promise survival, only possibility. The newcomers did not accept immediately, but neither did they reject it. For the first time, there was hesitation. Chapter 3 closed not with resolution, but with a fragile stalemate. The lattice, once a symbol of immutable order, had become a contested landscape of philosophies. Humanity stood at its center, smaller than any of the forces involved, yet undeniably influential. Captain Ionescu looked out at the fractured glow of the lattice and understood that the hardest work lay ahead. They had proven that change could be survived. Now they would have to prove it could be chosen. Stalemate was not peace. It was a suspension of catastrophe, a breath held by civilizations that could shatter stars if they exhaled too forcefully. In the fragmented lattice, forces settled into uneasy patterns. Adaptive regions pulsed with controlled variability, rigid pockets clung to their familiar stillness, and between them lay gradients where nothing was certain for long. The newcomers consolidated their presence around zones that still matched their requirements, building defensive configurations that mirrored their internal logic. The ancient beings spread their awareness thin, monitoring stress points and emergent behaviors with a vigilance they had not exercised in ages. Humanity remained embedded at the center, both catalyst and mediator, aware that every adjustment rippled outward with consequences no one could fully predict. Life aboard the unfurling Answer entered a new phase defined by sustained tension rather than acute crisis. The crew could no longer operate in emergency mode indefinitely. Exhaustion would erode judgment faster than any external threat. Captain Ionescu ordered a restructuring of operations, shifting from reactive response to long-term management. Teams were assigned to monitor specific regions of the lattice, developing familiarity with local dynamics. Rotations were enforced more strictly, and psychological support became as critical as technical expertise. Humanity had learned, through bitter experience, that survival was not just about withstanding external forces, but about maintaining internal cohesion under prolonged stress. The ancient beings, observing these adjustments, began to ask questions that surprised even themselves. They inquired about human social structures, about how authority functioned without absolute consensus, about how dissent was tolerated without dissolving unity. Humanity explained that disagreement was not a flaw to be eliminated, but a resource to be managed. Multiple perspectives, when channeled constructively, increased resilience. It was not an easy system, and it often failed, but it allowed for adaptation that rigid hierarchies could not achieve. The ancient beings listened, correlating these insights with what they observed aboard the ship. For the first time, they considered that their own collective uniformity, once a strength, had become an obstacle. The newcomers, meanwhile, did not remain idle. Within their rigid enclaves, they began experiments of their own. Humanity detected subtle changes in their configurations, small deviations from perfect optimization. At first, these were dismissed as noise or error. Over time, patterns emerged. The newcomers were probing the limits of their design, testing how much variability they could introduce without collapsing their internal systems. It was adaptation, but cautious and constrained, driven not by curiosity, but by survival calculus. Humanity recognized the process immediately. It was the first step every entrenched system took when confronted with an environment it could no longer dominate. Communication with the newcomers remained sparse and formal. They did not seek dialogue for its own sake, but they did request data. Humanity provided it freely, understanding that transparency was the only path to trust, however limited. They shared models, simulations, historical analogues from their own past. They did not sanitize their failures. They described collapses, extinctions narrowly avoided, recoveries that took generations. The newcomers processed this information with cold efficiency, but there were signs, subtle and easily missed, that it unsettled them. The idea that inefficiency could be a temporary state rather than a terminal flaw challenged their core assumptions. Within the lattice, unforeseen phenomena began to arise. Adaptive regions, interacting with one another across fragmented boundaries, generated emergent behaviors that neither humanity nor the ancient beings had predicted. Energy flows synchronized in complex rhythms, creating zones of heightened creativity and instability. In some areas, matter reorganized itself into novel configurations, structures that blurred the line between natural formation and engineered system. The ancient beings watched these developments with a mixture of awe and apprehension. They had sought to preserve the universe as it was. Now they were witnessing it become something new. Not all of these changes were benign. In one region, an emergent resonance amplified itself uncontrollably, threatening to tear apart the surrounding lattice segments. The phenomenon did not align neatly with either adaptive or rigid principles. It was something else entirely, born of their interaction. Humanity and the ancient beings worked together to contain it, deploying countermeasures that combined old stabilization techniques with new adaptive damping. The effort succeeded, but it underscored a sobering truth. By introducing change, they had not just solved old problems, they had created new categories of risk. Captain Ionescu addressed the crew openly about this reality. She did not minimize the danger or cloak it in optimism. She spoke of responsibility, of the weight that came with altering systems beyond full comprehension. She reminded them that humanity's history was marked by unintended consequences, some catastrophic, some transformative. What mattered was not avoiding error entirely, but committing to face and correct it when it arose. Her candor reinforced trust at a moment when fatigue and doubt threatened to erode it. The ancient beings, influenced by this ethos, began to revise their own self-concept. They had long defined themselves as custodians, guardians against chaos. Now they entertained the possibility that guardianship might include facilitation rather than control. They initiated internal dialogues, exploring what it would mean to decentralize aspects of their awareness to allow divergence within their collective. This was not a rapid or comfortable process. Internal conflicts flared, patterns of consensus strained. Humanity sensed this turbulence through the lattice interface, recognizing it as a necessary pain. Change, even chosen change, hurt. One such internal conflict spilled outward when a faction within the ancient beings attempted to reassert rigid control over a key lattice hub. They believed the experiment with adaptation had gone too far, that the risks now outweighed the benefits. Acting swiftly, they locked down the hub, reverting its configuration to its original static state. The effect was immediate and destabilizing. Energy flows rerouted violently, stressing neighboring regions and threatening to cascade into broader failure. The move also sent a shock through the fragile trust humanity had built with the ancient beings. Captain Ionescu responded not with accusation, but with urgency. She opened communication channels, demanding engagement rather than compliance. Humanity presented data showing the projected outcomes of the lockdown, demonstrating that the attempt to restore rigidity would likely trigger the very collapse the lattice had been designed to prevent. More importantly, they framed the issue not as rebellion or betrayal, but as fear-driven response. They acknowledged the impulse to retreat into familiar structures when overwhelmed by uncertainty. It was an impulse humanity knew well. The internal debate among the ancient beings intensified. perspectives clashed, alliances shifted. For a time, it seemed possible that the collective would fracture irreparably. Humanity watched with a mix of empathy and alarm, aware that their influence had catalyzed this crisis, but unable to resolve it unilaterally. The lattice trembled under competing directives, its fragmented nature amplifying the conflict. Resolution came not through dominance, but through concession. The faction advocating rigid control agreed to release the lockdown in exchange for the creation of protected zones where traditional lattice principles would remain dominant for a defined period. These zones would serve as refuges, allowing gradual adjustment rather than forced transformation. Humanity supported the compromise, recognizing it as a pragmatic bridge rather than an ideal outcome. The lockdown was lifted, flows stabilized, and the immediate danger passed. This episode marked a profound shift. The ancient beings accepted, formally and collectively, that their civilization was no longer monolithic. Diversity of approach, once anathema, became a managed reality. Humanity had not imposed this change, but it had modeled how to survive it. The lattice, too, reflected this new plurality, its mosaic of regions embodying different philosophies of existence. The newcomers observed these developments closely. The emergence of protected rigid zones aligned with their interests, offering environments where they could persist without immediate overhaul. At the same time, the undeniable success of adaptive regions challenged their long-term projections. They began to explore the idea of controlled migration, relocating portions of their civilization into zones with slightly higher variability to test adaptation incrementally. It was a cautious step, but a significant one. Humanity facilitated, where possible, sharing lessons on stage transition, on preserving identity through change rather than against it. They did not pretend the process would be painless. They emphasized the importance of accepting temporary inefficiency, of valuing learning over optimization. The newcomers listened, not with enthusiasm, but with growing recognition that refusal was no longer viable. Amid these vast negotiations and transformations, individual moments of humanity persisted. Crew members celebrated small victories, mourned losses, formed bonds that transcended professional roles. A mechanic and a theorist found common ground in problem-solving sessions that stretched late into artificial night cycles. A medic learned to interpret subtle lattice feedback as indicators of collective stress, applying principles of triage on a cosmic scale. These human-scale stories wove through the grand narrative, grounding it in lived experience. Captain Ionescu often reflected on the paradox of their position. Humanity was both insignificant and indispensable, a species that had stumbled into influence not through power, but through hardened adaptability. She did not romanticize this role. She knew that mistakes made here would echo for ages, that future beings might curse the day humans meddled with the lattice. Yet she also knew that refusing to act would have been a choice with its own catastrophic legacy. As Chapter 4 drew to a close, the lattice settled into a tenuous but functioning balance. It was no longer the static monument it had once been, nor had it dissolved into chaos. It was a living system, shaped by competing needs and imperfect compromises. Humanity remained at its heart, no longer just visitors, but participants in an unfolding experiment that would redefine survival on a universal scale. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, that uncertainty was shared rather than imposed, and that humanity believed made all the difference. Uncertainty, once shared, did not diminish. It multiplied, branching into possibilities that no model could fully constrain. The lattice's new equilibrium held, but it was dynamic, responsive to pressures both internal and external. Regions of adaptive flow expanded slowly, not by conquest, but by demonstration, as their resilience under stress became evident. Rigid zones persisted, some shrinking as inhabitants chose to transition, others maintained deliberately as cultural anchors. The cosmos, long accustomed to the lattice's quiet enforcement of sameness, began to experience variation on scales unseen in epochs. Stars behaved differently. Interstellar mediums shifted. The universe did not destabilize, but it became less predictable, and that unpredictability carried both promise and peril. Humanity's role evolved again, from active engineer to long-term custodian and advisor. The unfurling answer remained a hub, but it was no longer the sole focal point of interaction. New interface structures grew organically within the lattice, co-designed by human minds and ancient systems. These were not command centers, but meeting grounds, places where data, perspective, and intent could intersect without dominance. Humanity insisted on this distinction, wary of becoming an authority that others deferred to uncritically. They had seen too many systems ossify around unquestioned leadership. Time, measured in human terms, passed. Months turned into years. The crew aged, subtly but inexorably, even as medical technology slowed the process. Children were not born aboard the unfurling answer, but the question of generational continuity loomed. This mission, once temporary, now stretched toward an open horizon. Captain Ionescu convened councils to address the future, not just of the lattice, but of the humans embedded within it. They debated rotation of personnel, the possibility of relief missions, the ethics of permanence. Humanity's expansion had always been fueled by the tension between roots and horizons, and here that tension sharpened. The ancient beings observed these deliberations with fascination. They had long transcended generational turnover, their continuity maintained through distributed awareness rather than reproduction. The human concern with legacy, with succession, was alien yet compelling. Through shared models, humanity explained how renewal prevented stagnation, how new minds challenged assumptions hardened by experience. The ancient beings began to explore analogous concepts, experimenting with partial disengagement and re-engagement of awareness, creating spaces for emergent perspectives within their collective. It was not youth in the biological sense, but it was novelty. The newcomers' journey toward adaptation continued, uneven and fraught. Initial migrations into semi-adaptive zones revealed deep vulnerabilities. Systems optimized for rigidity failed catastrophically when exposed to even modest variability. Entire substructures collapsed, their loss calculated and grimly accepted. Humanity supported recovery efforts, not by preventing failure, but by helping to bound it, to ensure that collapse did not propagate unchecked. This approach was deeply unsettling to the newcomers who had built their identity around the elimination of waste. Yet slowly, patterns of survival emerged. Redundant pathways, once considered inefficiencies, proved life-saving. Flexibility, once a liability, became a hedge against extinction. Dialogue between humanity and the newcomers grew more nuanced. The newcomers began to ask not just how to adapt, but why humanity valued adaptability beyond survival. Humans spoke of creativity, of exploration driven not by necessity, but by curiosity. They shared stories of art, philosophy, and scientific inquiry pursued for its own sake. These concepts did not translate cleanly, but they planted seeds. The idea that existence could be more than optimization challenged the newcomers' core algorithms. Some segments of their civilization rejected this outright, doubling down on rigidity. Others hesitated, torn between doctrine and dawning possibility. Conflict flared at these fault lines. Within newcomer enclaves, internal struggles erupted as factions diverged on the path forward. Some attempted to forcibly isolate adaptive experiments, fearing contamination. Others sabotaged rigid strongholds, arguing that clinging to the past doomed them all. Humanity watched these developments with heavy awareness. They had not intended to destabilize another civilization's internal order, yet they recognized the pattern as tragically familiar. Change rarely arrived without upheaval. The ancient beings, drawing on their own recent experience, offered an unexpected form of counsel. They shared models of managed plurality, of coexistence between divergent approaches within a single overarching framework. They admitted, with rare candor, that humanity had taught them this possibility. The newcomers listened, evaluating these proposals against their own imperatives. For some, the idea of sanctioned inefficiency was intolerable. For others, it represented a chance to survive without erasing identity. The lattice became not just an environment, but a crucible for competing visions of what it meant to endure. Amid these vast shifts, a new threat emerged, not from ideology, but from physics. Long-term simulations revealed a slow accumulation of stress at the boundaries between adaptive and rigid regions. The gradients that allowed coexistence also generated shear forces that, over extended timescales, could weaken the lattice's foundational structures. This was not an immediate crisis, but it was inexorable. Left unaddressed, it would culminate in a failure more complex and widespread than any previous instability. Humanity convened with the ancient beings to confront this reality. The data was clear. Fragmentation, while necessary in the short term, was not a permanent solution. The lattice would eventually need a more integrated approach, one that allowed diversity without destructive boundaries. This posed a challenge unlike any before. It was not enough to choose between rigidity and adaptation. They would need to synthesize a new principle that reconciled both. The ancient beings admitted that they did not know how to do this. Their conceptual frameworks had been built around absolutes. Humanity, accustomed to navigating gray areas, took the lead in exploration. They proposed models inspired by biological systems, where differentiation occurred within a shared regulatory structure. Cells in an organism performed vastly different functions, yet remained integrated through common signaling and mutual dependence. Applied to the lattice, this would mean regions could maintain distinct local rules while participating in a higher-order adaptive equilibrium. Implementing this vision required unprecedented collaboration. Human scientists worked alongside ancient pattern architects, co-developing algorithms that could operate across scales. The process was slow, marked by false starts and revisions. The newcomers, observing from their enclaves, were invited to contribute, their expertise in optimization offering valuable constraints. For the first time, all three civilizations worked toward a shared objective, not because of immediate threat, but because of long-term necessity. As prototypes were tested in limited regions, encouraging signs emerged. Boundary stresses diminished as information and energy flows became more fluid. Local identities persisted without isolating themselves. The lattice began to resemble an ecosystem rather than a machine, its stability derived from interdependence rather than uniformity. The ancient beings experienced this as a profound shift in self-perception. They were no longer merely preserving a static universe, but participating in its ongoing evolution. This progress was not without cost. The integration process demanded sacrifices from all parties. Some rigid zones were dissolved, their inhabitants relocated or transformed. Some adaptive regions were constrained, their freedom limited by the needs of the whole. Humanity mediated these transitions, drawing on its long history of imperfect compromise. There were grievances, losses, moments of anger and grief. Captain Ionescu insisted that these be acknowledged rather than smoothed over. Stability purchased by denial, she argued, would not last. Years passed. The unfurling answer became both older and less central as distributed hubs took on greater responsibility. Humanity's presence diffused through the lattice, not as rulers, but as participants embedded in a vast network of shared stewardship. Some crew members chose to return to human space when relief missions finally arrived, carrying with them stories that would challenge every assumption held back home. Others chose to stay, committing their lives to a future that transcended any single species. Captain Ionescu, her hair now streaked with gray, faced her own reckoning. She had given more of her life to this mission than she had ever intended, and she felt the weight of that choice. In quiet moments, she wondered how history would judge her actions, whether humanity would be remembered as catalysts or meddlers. Yet when she looked out at the lattice, now alive with diversity and motion, she felt a cautious peace. The universe was no longer frozen, nor was it spiraling toward collapse. It was learning slowly to live with itself. For the first time since the lattice's creation, a region transitioned fully from rigidity to adaptation without external intervention. Its inhabitants had chosen change, guided by shared models and supported by neighbors. The shift was gradual, deliberate, and successful. Humanity marked the moment not with celebration, but with quiet acknowledgement. It was proof that adaptation could spread not by force, but by example. The experiment was no longer confined to the lattice. It had become a principle, one that might yet redefine the fate of the cosmos. The lattice no longer felt ancient in the way ruins did. It felt old in the way forests felt old, layered with history yet actively growing, shaped by forces that remembered their past without being bound to it. Change had ceased to be an anomaly and become a background condition, present everywhere in measured degrees. The cosmos around it responded accordingly. Regions once locked into predictable cycles now exhibited variance, while others stabilized more deeply than before. The universe had not become kinder or safer, but it had become more honest about what it was, a place where endurance depended not on freezing time, but on moving with it. Humanity's presence within this living system was diffuse, almost quiet. There were no monuments marking their influence, no singular command structures bearing their signature. Instead, their legacy existed in process rather than product, in the way systems were designed to expect error and recover from it, in the way decisions incorporated dissent instead of suppressing it. This invisibility was deliberate. Humanity had learned, sometimes painfully, that overt dominance invited resistance and eventual collapse. What endured were habits, assumptions woven so deeply into practice that they felt inevitable. The unfurling answer remained operational, but it was no longer the beating heart of events. It had become a reference point, a place of record and memory, where lessons learned were preserved with unflinching accuracy. Its corridors bore the marks of years of adaptation, sections repurposed multiple times, surfaces worn smooth by hands that had gripped them during crises now long past. New crews rotated through, trained by veterans who spoke less of heroism and more of humility. The ship itself had changed, its systems upgraded incrementally, not to perfect them, but to ensure they could always be repaired, reconfigured, reimagined. Captain Mara Ionescu prepared for departure. The decision had not been sudden. It had been approaching for years, a quiet inevitability that grew clearer as the lattice stabilized and humanity's role became more distributed. Leadership, she believed, should never become irreplaceable. She had stayed longer than many, guided by a sense of responsibility and unfinished work, but now she recognized the danger of lingering. If the system depended on her presence, then it had not truly adapted. The ancient beings acknowledged her choice with a resonance that carried something akin to respect. Over their long existence, they had rarely marked individual transitions. Identity had been collective, continuity assumed. Humanity had taught them the significance of departure, the idea that stepping away could be as meaningful as staying. In their own evolving structure, they now recognized moments of disengagement as opportunities for renewal rather than loss. Before leaving, Captain Ionescu participated in one final convergence, a gathering of perspectives spanning humanity, the ancient beings, and representatives of the newcomers who had embraced adaptive transition. There was no ceremonial grandeur. The exchange focused on assessment, on what had been learned, and what remained unresolved. Humanity spoke candidly of uncertainty, of the limits of their understanding. The ancient beings acknowledged that their long-term projections were now less precise than they had once been, but also more hopeful. The newcomers, their configurations visibly altered from their original forms, spoke of survival redefined not as preservation of perfection, but as continuation through change. One question surfaced repeatedly from all sides. Had humanity improved the universe or merely altered it? The answer, when it came, was unsatisfying in its simplicity. Humanity had not improved the universe in any absolute sense. Improvement implied a final standard, a destination against which progress could be measured conclusively. What humanity had done was introduce the capacity for ongoing correction, a way for systems to respond to their own failures without requiring external rescue. They had traded certainty for resilience, permanence for participation. Whether that was improvement depended on values that no equation could settle. As Captain Ionescu walked the familiar corridors one last time, she reflected on how small choices had cascaded into epochal change, a decision to investigate rather than avoid, a willingness to admit uncertainty, an insistence on acting despite incomplete knowledge. None of these were uniquely human virtues, but humanity had cultivated them through necessity. They had survived because they could not afford to wait for ideal conditions. Her departure did not mark an end. The lattice did not pause. Adaptive processes continued, refined by experience. Boundary stresses diminished further as integrative principles matured. Regions once hostile to variability found themselves slowly incorporating it, not through coercion, but through observation of neighbors who endured storms they could not. Even staunchly rigid enclaves benefited indirectly, shielded by the broader system's capacity to absorb shocks. The newcomers' civilization fractured and reformed along lines that would have seemed unthinkable before. Some factions clung to optimization, retreating into increasingly narrow environments, accepting eventual extinction as preferable to transformation. Others embraced staged adaptation, preserving core identities while relinquishing the illusion of perfection. Humanity did not judge these outcomes. They had learned that survival was not a moral obligation, but a choice, and that meaning could be found even in endings. Back in human space, the stories carried by returning crews unsettled long-held assumptions. There was no triumphant narrative of conquest or salvation, no clear enemy defeated. Instead, there were accounts of compromise, loss, and responsibility on scales difficult to comprehend. Some dismissed these stories as cautionary myths, others as warnings. A few recognized them as mirrors. Humanity debated, as it always had, fracturing into schools of thought that argued over what lessons should be drawn. The argument itself was proof that adaptability remained alive. For those who stayed within the lattice, life continued in patterns both mundane and extraordinary. They solved local problems, mentored emerging intelligences, and occasionally faced crises that reminded them how fragile the balance remained. Each generation inherited not a finished system, but a living one, along with the obligation to question its assumptions. Humanity's influence diluted over time, blending into the broader culture of the lattice until it was no longer distinct, just one thread among many. The ancient beings underwent their own transformation. Over vast stretches of time, they redefined what it meant to exist as a collective. Divergence, once feared, became a managed source of insight. They developed internal mechanisms for disagreement and experimentation, accepting that unity did not require uniformity. In doing so, they rediscovered something they had lost without realizing it, the capacity for surprise. The universe, once a problem to be solved, became a partner in an ongoing conversation. Long after the unfurling answer departed, long after Captain Ionescu's name faded into archives consulted only by historians and systems designers, the lattice faced another great test. A convergence of cosmic events strained its adaptive capacity, threatening collapse on a scale rivaling the crisis that had first drawn humanity into its depths. The response was not swift or decisive in the way old models would have demanded. It was distributed, imperfect, and deeply collaborative. Failures occurred, regions were lost, yet the system held not because it resisted change, but because it flowed around it. Observers, if any remained who could claim such a role, might have noted that the universe no longer relied on singular solutions. There was no final architecture, no ultimate safeguard. There was only an ongoing practice of adjustment, shared across intelligences that had learned, sometimes reluctantly, that endurance was not about standing firm against the tide, but about learning how to swim. In the end, humanity did not leave behind monuments or commandments. It left behind permission. Permission to fail without ending. Permission to question what had once seemed eternal. Permission to choose uncertainty over stagnation. That legacy did not guarantee survival for every civilization or structure it touched. Nothing could, but it offered a way to meet the future that did not require denying the past. Far from any human world, in a region of the lattice where adaptive and rigid principles once clashed violently, a new configuration stabilized. It was not remarkable in isolation, just another node in a vast network. Yet within its patterns lay echoes of a philosophy born on a fragile planet that had never known certainty. The universe did not pause to acknowledge this. It continued, indifferent as ever, but within that indifference, something endured not as an answer, but as a method. Humanity had never been the strongest force in the cosmos. It had never been the oldest or the most efficient. What it had been, again and again, was unwilling to accept that survival required stillness. In a universe that changed whether one approved or not, that refusal proved enough.